chains to countries like Japan or China, I will rather move them to Mexico, because Mexico is close to me. Mexico, I am able to influence the politics of Mexico a little bit better than I'm able to influence the politics of nations halfway across the world. I'm more in sync, I'm closer, the costs will be lesser. So that's what nearshoring means. And yes, there is this bullwhip effect. I'll just briefly mention this. This basically means that small considerations, for example, a small consideration that an Indian MSME does not want to import the raw materials for its pharma products from China. This is a very small thing. A single company sitting in, let's say, Hyderabad, which is a pharma center, pharma hub, a small MSME sitting in Hyderabad does not want to import the raw materials for its pharma products from China. So this small thing and can have a larger effect in the sense that this sentiment will spread amongst the various companies there, because they are seeing some benefit in this company shifting its supply chains to a more secure place other than China. So if this sentiment becomes large enough, this can actually start reorienting supply chains at the country level. So a small sentiment in terms of shifting supply chains can lead to a larger policy shift of the entire country, which I think the government is also promoting. For example, the government's push for vocal for local or make in India, assemble in India. What are these promoting? These are promoting the ideas that people should start buying Indian products. People should start buying Indian products so that the dependence on other nations decreases. This is like the practical manifestation of what the bullwhip effect shows. Okay, JIT, JIC supply chains I mentioned, and security and globalization, as I was mentioning. So this is a thinker, Ian Bremmer. We study him in IR. He has given this idea that security will inevitably become a more important aspect of the globalization in the upcoming years. And along with security and globalization, this is also being clubbed with the idea of self-reliance, of course, or what the Indian government calls Atmanirbharta, where rather than even friend-shoring and near-shoring, what if we are able to bring the supply chains into the country? This is what China has been able to do for many products, from zero raw material to 100% of the finished product. Some clusters in China produce everything within a span of 100 kilometers. Just imagine the positivity and the industrial inertia that creates. India has fragmented supply chains in place of that. So I think that can be a very good example to quote also. Yeah, China is an adversary to India, but it has a lot of things that we can learn. So I think this is about the supply chain disruptions due to the Ukraine conflict. Now we'll move on to the impact on the global south because of the Ukraine war. Here, just a question. Is my voice echoing by any chance? Like, is anyone able to hear an echo? Cool. Okay. Okay, impact on the global south. So, yeah, so when the Ukraine war started in 2022, there was a very big difference in how the various types of various countries in the world saw the Ukraine conflict. For Europe as well as Ukraine, it represented a threat to the entire liberal international order as we know it today. So when I say liberal international order, it means the rules-based order that is centered around the United Nations and other multilateral global organizations. They saw it as a threat against this entire liberal international order, because Russia attacked Ukraine in a very unprovoked manner. No one provoked Russia. Of course, like Putin says different, that US provoked Russia. But okay, if we look at only the military realities, no one attacked Russia in any way. No one threatened to attack. Okay, I think sometime or the other USA might have threatened, but yes, Ukraine didn't threaten Russia in any way. So it can be called at least an unprovoked attack in terms of the military. So Europe saw it like that, like a threat to the liberal international order. But the nations which are not situated in Europe, especially larger nations like India or Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, African nations, even Latin American nations like Brazil, they saw it as a regional conflict which had global ramifications. And these global ramifications were in the form of supply chain disruptions, as I was mentioning earlier, the 3F issue, that is the food, fuel, fertilizer issue. Just to, I'm just trying to put this small acronym here to make it a bit memorable, that these three were one of the primary things that were affected in terms of the pricing. So the global south had issues with these 3F things. For example, the food, fuel, fertilizer prices increased. But they nonetheless saw it as a regional conflict. And if you remember, during somewhere around this time, the Honorable External Affairs Minister of India, Subramaniam Jaishankar, had given that statement that Europe needs to come out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. That actually encapsulated this whole idea very nicely, that India does not see that as a global threat. India sees that as a regional threat. Hence, we will see our own national interest, which will involve buying crude from Russia if it's at a cheaper cost. And that works for other nations as well, because India was not the only global south nation that was buying oil from Russia, although it was one of the most criticized one, because other countries did not hold that much leverage in the International Committee of Nations. Okay, so different view in West, attack against the liberal international order, and developing nations saw it as a regional war with global impact on supply chains. And of course, in such issues, whenever there is some disturbance across the world, be it a regional conflict or a global conflict, there is generally a capital flight from the more developing nations, which are seen as more risky. For example, a lot of dollars, the foreign portfolio investments, they traveled out of India towards safer assets, and one of the safest being the US Treasury bills, which is the sovereign bonds issued by the US government. Just why war was there between Ukraine and Russia? यार थोड़ा डाइग्रेस कर जाएंगे, मतलब मेरे पास ना बहुत सारे टॉपिक्स हैं, बट ठीक है, I'll just give you a 2-minute thing. Okay. Russia-Ukraine war. See, I'll tell you what happened exactly. 1991, Soviet Union dissolved. What did this lead to? So, if you are aware of the Cold War and the equations during the Cold War, the main idea of Cold War was US-led bloc versus Soviet Union-led bloc. Soviet Union, basically, if anyone doesn't know, it's the parent country or the original country that led to the formation of Russia later on. Okay, my voice is echoing. यार ये ना इसलिए हो रहा है because I have joined from 2 devices and the voice from one of the devices is coming to this mic again. Okay, so I'll try to make sure this doesn't happen. Yeah, the Soviet Union dissolved in the early 1990s, somewhere around 91, 92, and that led to basically, if NATO's only aim, NATO is basically the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, its only aim was that it was a military alliance against the Soviet Union. That if Soviet Union was to attack any of the countries in NATO, all the other countries will come to the defense of that country and attack the aggressor. That was the idea behind NATO. That is one for all and all for one. So when Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, 1992, ideally NATO's, the whole purpose of NATO was defeated because Soviet Union was not there. But NATO did not dissolve. And in fact, during that time, many of the US leaders had promised the Russian leaders that NATO will not move even an inch towards the east. So if you look at the blocks during the Cold War, there was the Berlin Wall, that Germany was divided into West and East Germany. Berlin Wall fell in 1989. And of course, there was the Iron Curtain between the Western European nations and the Eastern European nations. The Eastern European nations being under the Soviet Union bloc and the Western European nations being under the influence of the USA. So after dissolution of Soviet Union, the NATO countries, they started increasing towards the east. Basically, the Eastern European nations also started joining NATO. For example, North Macedonia had joined, I think, in 2021 or 2020, very recently. Along with that, in 2008, there was even a proposal for Georgia to join NATO. Georgia is on the southern border of Russia. And then, because of this threat that Georgia can join NATO, Putin actually had invaded Georgia also in 2008. I won't go into the details of that right now. And there was even some talks of Ukraine joining NATO. So that was the point when Putin actually drew a red line. There is a very famous speech of Vladimir Putin from 2007 Munich Security Conference. I think everyone should just watch it. It's on 1.5x if possible. It's a very good speech. He actually very nicely put forward that idea that how the West had been lying to Russia all along from the 1990s, that they will not take NATO towards the east, but they kept inching NATO towards the east, and they did never try to bring Russia into the security architecture of the European Union, which Russia actually wanted to. Russia actually wanted to join the EU at some point, but USA never allowed that. because if Russia, a bigger power like Russia, would have joined the EU, the influence of USA, countries like USA in the European Union would have decreased. Hence, the US never allowed Russia to integrate with the European countries. And that's what 2007 Munich Security Conference, Vladimir Putin actually highlighted. And this was sort of I think the end point of Putin's, what I can say, calm and composure, and it's the limits of his irritability with the West. After that, he kept on becoming progressively more irritated with the West. And into 2014, because there were very strong proposals by USA for Ukraine to join NATO, which would have been a red line. Putin actually invaded Ukraine and captured the Crimean Peninsula, which I was mentioning here. This Crimean Peninsula was actually taken over by Putin in 2014 only, and these are the regions in 2022. And also, Vladimir Putin also. So in 2014, just before the Crimean crisis, the government in Ukraine was actually a pro-Russian one, but there were some protests in Ukraine, and the pro-Russian person, his name was, okay, it does not matter what his name was, Yanukovych, he actually was overthrown, and a pro-US government was installed in Ukraine. And of course, Putin made the argument that these protests were manufactured by the USA, and because these protests were manufactured by the USA, this change in government was not valid, and hence that was like the limit. Then happened the Crimean crisis, and after that, this crisis even worsened. And in 2022, I think Joe Biden had started increasing the sanctions on Russia even more and more, and hence he saw that time limit, his time limit crossed in his own mind, and he invaded Ukraine again in 2022. Okay, moving on. Impact on global south, I think we have done. Currency, capital flight hota hai. Capital flight kyun hota hai? Whenever there is a crisis anywhere in the world, people, especially the volatile money that is there, which is the FPI inflows, the foreign portfolio investments, they are taken off. Basically, they are from the capital market and not. I'm hoping everyone knows the difference between FPI and FDI. I'll move on. So, जो money है capital market से, it is taken away to the safe havens. Some things like safe havens like the US Treasury bonds. And what that does is, whenever there is a capital flight, it leads to a depreciation pressure on the Indian rupee. Why? Because if you are taking a lot of dollars out from the Indian market, the supply of dollars in the Indian market reduces, the supply of Indian rupees increases, which leads to a depreciation pressure on the Indian rupee. Yes, and taper tantrum, I'll quickly mention. Taper tantrum actually means that whenever there is a crisis, let's say, in the global economy, there is a tendency for the US Federal Reserve to increase its interest rates. And if the US Federal Reserve increases its interest rates, there is an increased capital inflow into the USA from different countries across the world, including India. And these are called taper tantrums. That is the outflow of money from the developing nations towards USA. Taper tantrums, taper means tapering of the interest rate by the US Federal Reserve, and it's just called taper tantrums. Yes, and currency depreciation pressure on the global currencies like India. And of course, whenever there is a currency depreciation, it can actually lead to inflation also, because whenever there is currency depreciation, for example, right now, the Indian rupee is almost 92 to the dollar. In such cases, because of currency depreciation, the imports into the country, they become expensive. India, we need to remember that, yes, whenever there is currency depreciation, the exports of a country become more competitive, because let's say पहले अगर मेरे को 70 रुपए का मैं कुछ बाहर बेच रहा हूँ, तो पहले that would have been $0.8, now it is $0.7, because my currency actually depreciated. For the consumer sitting in USA, Indian products actually become cheap. So exports of India actually become more competitive whenever there is currency depreciation of the Indian rupee. However, it is important to remember that India is not an export-driven economy. We are an import-driven economy. I think we are an import-driven economy. We always generally have a trade deficit with most nations. So that is why whenever there is the depreciation of the Indian rupee, it actually leads to imported inflation, because net we are importing more, and if we are importing more, we are importing more costly, because imports become costlier. So all of this happens because of these disturbances that keep happening across the globe. Yes. Okay. So if we look at the Ukraine conflict from the perspective of India, I've told you about the general issues that took place, what were the facts of the issue, what were the supply chain disruptions that were happening globally, what was the specific impact on the global south. Now, if we talk about the impact specifically on India, there were definitely some strategic wins for India. And these strategic wins came in the form of discounted crude oil. So, because there were sanctions on Russia, it could not sell its fuel and natural gas in the open market. So, it actually had to sell the crude oil at a discount so that countries actually bought the Russian oil because there were already sanctions on it. So, India, of course, lapped up a lot of Russian crude during 22, 2023 and 2024. And Russia actually became the largest supplier of Indian crude, where earlier it was, I think, not even fourth or fifth. So that definitely helped India a lot and let increase the Indian trade with Russia, bilateral trade, to $65 billion from about $18-19 billion within 1 year. This is unheard of, by the way. This was all because of crude. However, the main problem was that out of the $65 billion, I think close to $61 billion was a trade deficit of India because India was importing that much from Russia and not exporting a lot. Next, after of course, we got the discounted crude. It actually also helped us increase the local currency trade. So rupee ruble trade actually increased quite a lot, not that much as the governments would have wanted, but yes, it definitely helped us increase the rupee ruble trade. And what exactly happens when we are trading more in local currencies? We are dependent less on the dollar. And if we are dependent less on the dollar, we are dependent less on the monetary policy of some other third country rather than our own. So that's definitely a positive. And of course, India emerged as the voice of the global south. Even the Prime Minister, in fact, also hosted Voice of Global South summits in our G20 presidency year, which was 2023, 2 years back. So it helped us emerge as the voice of the global south because through various statements, as even the External Affairs Minister's statement of Europe's problems, the world's problems, that one, and also other stances that India actually took, they all were the global south nations identified with that stance a lot because everyone expected, the West expected every country to just toe its line on the Russian crisis. कि हाँ भाई हमें problem है Russia से, तुम भी problem कर लो जबरदस्ती. The West expected that. That's how the West functions. But India actually came up with its own independent stance, and a lot of global south countries actually identified with that also. That why should we suffer? We are least developed nations. Why should we suffer for a regional conflict halfway across the world? So that helped India emerge as a voice of the global south also. Other than these strategic wins, of course, there were strategic challenges. India is dependent on Russian defense supplies a lot. So those defense supplies were delayed indefinitely. India actually signed the contract for the S-400 air defense system from Russia in 2018. The contract was to be completed in 2022 or 2023. Today it's 2026 and we still haven't got our supplies in full measure. Of course, when the Russia-Ukraine war started, Russia was quite isolated internationally, and India and China were the only two large nations that were in talking terms with Russia. India was on talking terms. China was completely on the Russian side. So that strengthened the China-Russia axis, which is definitely not in the best interest of countries like India, because we do not want our adversary, that is China, and our ally, not ally, but strategic, okay, what would be a word? Friend like Russia to come together. And of course, there were many of the Indian companies that were trading in Russian oil through third nations like Iran and Saudi Arabia. They faced secondary sanctions because even these companies they were not allowed to trade in Russian oil. So yes, secondary sanctions to Indian companies, private companies. Now, if we look at the way forward here, of course, India, as the Indian Prime Minister had told Vladimir Putin in one of the summits a few years ago, that this is not an era of war. We stand at the side of peace. When countries say that we're not taking any side, that's wrong. We are taking the side of peace, which is a moralistic stand and a bit idealistic, but yes, it's important because we are taking our own side. And that way, India can emerge as a peace broker also, because remember, although India is not on any one particular side right now, either with Russia or with Ukraine, it is the only large nation with a sufficient global diplomatic leverage that is in talking terms with both of them. Prime Minister Modi visited Russia and Ukraine during the war within a span of 1 month. I think it was 2025 on July and August, or 2024, I'm forgetting. So no other large country's leader can do that right now. So that means that we can definitely emerge as a peace broker. Other than that, of course, for defense supplies delay, there is no answer other than defense diversification and also becoming self-reliant in that. And we need to show economic pragmatism. If we are losing markets, let's say in countries like in any European country or in USA, because we are not seeing them eye to eye in conflicts like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we can explore alternative markets. And India is doing that by exploring FTAs with Latin American nations, with countries like Australia, with East Asian nations. There was a recent FTA of India with the UAE also. And of course, we have the recent FTA with, FTA means free trade agreement, if you don't know, with the European Union also. Okay, that is it with the Ukraine conflict, and we've already taken 40 minutes with this, which was quite a lot. We can't go into so much detail in every single topic, otherwise we won't be able to finish this. Okay, any doubts? Or we'll quickly move on to the Gaza crisis. जल्दी जल्दी बताओ, कुछ भी डाउट है तो hands, raise hands. Hello, am I audible? Okay, cool.
Sir, what can you repeat that? Secondary sanctions?
Okay, yeah, see, what happened is that India was not directly buying, at least later on, India was not directly buying a lot of the Russian crude. However, many of the Indian private companies were trading in Russian crude through through third countries. Like Russian crude was being diverted from UAE to India, or from China to India, or from let's say Iran to India. So the Indian private companies that were dealing with these third nations, but in Russian crude, they were sanctioned by the USA. So these were secondary sanctions that India had to face because it was still in talking terms and trade terms with Russia. Cool?
Yeah, sir. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Okay, बढ़ते हैं आगे. We'll move on to the Gaza conflict जल्दी से. Okay, so जल्दी से एक बार मैप देख लो पहले कि कहाँ पे है गाजा. Western, we call it West Asia. The West calls it Middle East. So यहाँ पे this region, यहाँ पे बहुत सारे कंट्रीज हैं, सीरिया, जॉर्डन, इजिप्ट एंड ऑफ कोर्स इजराइल. इजराइल के अंदर दो रीजन्स हैं विच फॉर्म पैलेस्टीन टुगेदर. वी हैव द वेस्ट बैंक एंड वी हैव गाजा. गाजा का एक्चुअली एरिया इट्स क्वाइट स्मॉल, इट्स इक्विवेलेंट टू नोएडा एज फार एज आई रिमेंबर. वेस्ट बैंक जो है, व्हाई इज इट कॉल्ड द वेस्ट बैंक? बिकॉज इट इज ऑन द वेस्ट बैंक ऑफ द जॉर्डन रिवर. दिस इज द जॉर्डन रिवर. I'm marking it on the PPT. This is the west bank of the Jordan River, so that's why it's called the West Bank. And these two enclaves of Palestine are not directly connected, of course, as it's visible here in the diagram. So what is the latest news that is happening? Basic conflict के जो facts हैं वो बता देता हूँ मैं पहले. There was an attack by Hamas. Hamas is a militant organization supported by Iran, which was ruling Gaza Strip. So Gaza is also called the Gaza Strip because it's in the shape of a strip. So the Hamas group was ruling on the Gaza Strip, and they attacked Israel in October 2023. It was a terrorist attack, and I think close to 1,200 civilians, Israeli civilians, died, including babies, and women were brutalized badly. So of course Israel had to retaliate, and which led to a humanitarian crisis, because Israel practically did carpet bombing of the entire Gaza Strip. So carpet bombing is basically you bomb every single thing in sight without any discrimination. If it's a civilian place or it's a hospital or it's a school, Israel bombed everything in sight. That has led to more than 70,000 fatalities in Gaza, which is one of the largest humanitarian disasters the 21st century is seeing. Of course, this is excluding other humanitarian crises which are taking place in countries like Somalia and Sudan. But yes, at least in eyes of the Western nations, it's one of the largest humanitarian crises of the 21st century. And 80% Gaza has been leveled, because of which billions and billions will probably go into the reconstruction whenever this war ends. And there is also a genocide case that has been filed by the government of South Africa against Israel in the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. Okay. So what is the latest thing that is happening in the Gaza conflict? There is a 20-point peace plan that was forwarded by the Trump administration and also was endorsed by the UNSC, that is the United Nations Security Council, which is the primary UN body which is responsible for security considerations across the globe. It passed a resolution 2803, not important to remember, in November 2025. And this plan, phase one, had been implemented earlier. It basically said that the war will be frozen, the lines will be frozen as they are right now. Both the sides will implement an immediate ceasefire. I think this was implemented a few months ago. Phase two had started being implemented, I think, mid-January 2026. And there is a city committee which has some members from the Palestinian government, earlier Palestinian government, and also from the Israeli government to make it bipartisan. And this city committee will be ruling Gaza, administering Gaza for some time. I'm not exactly aware till what time because there is no provision regarding that. But yes, this is a ad hoc committee that has been formed to administer Gaza. And also this plan involves demilitarization of Hamas, which I was mentioning was the militant organization that precipitated this attack in the first place. And there will be an international stabilization force. The ISF, or the International Stabilization Force, is basically a team of peacekeepers which will be supported by the Arab nations along outside the Israeli border, including Syria, Jordan, Egypt. And also this will be supported by the European nations as well. Yes, this is the 20-point peace plan of Trump, roughly. This has been endorsed by the UN, but it has not been completely accepted by the main stakeholders, which is the Israeli government and the Hamas group. But yes, there has been quite strong support for this plan by a lot of stakeholders. Along with this, there has been a provision or a board of peace that President Trump has forwarded, the idea of which was forwarded in Davos recently. Davos is the World Economic Forum 2026. So President Trump used this platform of the World Economic Forum to forward his idea of the board of peace. So basically what this will do is that it will establish a body where different countries can take part by paying $1 billion entry fee, and they will sit and decide on the global conflicts that are taking place across the globe. And President Trump, or Donald Trump, even when he stops being president of USA, Donald Trump will be the forever CEO or the forever chairperson of this board of peace. So basically, and many, so of course, this board of peace has been criticized by the European nations quite, I think, quite liberally. Most of the European nations have shown skepticism towards it and rejected it. Arab nations have accepted this mainly because they know that people like Trump, who are quite powerful, and of course the US government right now, they are primary stakeholders for security of the West Asian region. And if they do not go forward with it, there is a chance that the conflict will never subside. But Europe has definitely rejected because it is trying to establish a parallel organizational framework for achieving peace and security in the on the planet to the UN system basically. तो UNSC का भी मैंडेट जो है वो यही है. ओरिजिनली यूएनएससी का मैंडेट था टू प्रिवेंट कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स एंड वॉर्स. इस बोर्ड ऑफ पीस का मैंडेट क्या है? टू सॉल्व द कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स एंड वॉर्स दैट आर टेकिंग प्लेस. सो बेसिकली Trump is trying to establish a parallel organization to the UNSC, which that's why the European nations have rejected it. Israel and Hamas both have showed tacit acceptance because उनको अपना मतलब निकलते हुए दिख रहा है कि हाँ, if the war ends, that will be in the benefit of both these parties. India has shown strategic silence. It has not cleared its stand. India was invited to this board of peace during the World Economic Forum to sign the charter of this board of peace by President Trump, but India did not attend that. It did not sign the charter, and it has not officially stated that it will accept or reject. So, and because there are a lot of problems, so the mandate of this board is basically to resolve all conflicts that are there. All conflicts will include Kashmir conflict also, because many of the Western nations, they generally try to intervene in Indian domestic affairs quite a lot. Other than that, Pakistan has joined this board, and if the Kashmir conflict is there, then India wouldn't want the Pakistanis to get their way in that. And of course, it undermines the UN system as well. This is what's happening, the latest news that is happening now. So now we'll come to the analysis of this issue of the Gaza conflict and the Red Sea conflict. We'll do them together because they are quite related. I'm marking the Red Sea here. So just have a look at it, where it is. So this is the Arabian Peninsula that I'm marking. On the Arabian Peninsula, on the east, is the Persian Gulf. and on the west is the Red Sea. And here on this is the Arabian Peninsula. So peninsula is a landmass surrounded by water on three sides. So the Arabian Peninsula has countries like Saudi Arabia, Yemen. Okay, now we'll see the analysis of this issue. Supply chain disruptions, of course, any conflict happening on such important strategic choke points. So why am I saying this is an important strategic choke point? Because you can see right to the south of Israel is Egypt, and through Egypt passes the Suez Canal. What does the Suez Canal do? It connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, and Mediterranean Sea is the water body. I'm marking it again. This is the Mediterranean Sea, and Mediterranean Sea and Red Sea are connected by the Suez Canal through Egypt, and this is basically the primary waterway to connect the Indian Ocean with the European countries. So it's quite important from the perspective of logistics and waterways. So when the Israel-Palestine conflict started after Hamas's attack in October 2023, this shipping route was disrupted quite heavily, firstly, because of this war only, and because Israel had started bombing Gaza like anything. And after that, because the interest of the Hamas militants and the Palestinians was not being looked after because they were being killed and massacred in huge numbers by the Israeli government. Many of the actors in the region which supported the Palestinians, they came up in tacit support of the Palestinians. And how did they come in tacit support? So as I mentioned earlier, Hamas is a militant group that is funded by Iran. Iran also supports other militant groups across the region. So if you look at this small map that I'm showing here, so Red Sea mark हो गया, Red Sea mark हो गया. So this country that I'm marking here, this is Yemen, and Yemen has another militant group called the Houthis. Houthis are also supported by Iran. The Houthis started bombarding any of the trade ships that were passing through this Red Sea. Why? Because they say that they said that they were expressing their disapproval of Israeli actions in Palestine. So how is this connected? I'm not really sure. But the Houthis thought that it was connected. So they started bombing ships, and because of this bombing, the Red Sea route towards the Mediterranean Sea was disrupted quite heavily, and because of that, the ships had started taking the longer route. So in this diagram, there are two routes mentioned. The light red one is the one that was originally being used for ships going from Southeast Asia to Europe, and the dark brown one is the one that was being taken afterwards because of the disruption of the Red Sea route. And of course, as you can see, it's longer. It takes 20 to 30% more time, and of course, it takes 20 to 30% more money. And because of this, the logistics charges increased, the trading became more expensive, and of course, the fuel prices also increased because all of these things increase the demand for the fuel. And when the supply was not enough, the higher demand led to higher prices of the fuel. And this point is called the Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost point of South Africa. Longer route shipping costs and this was happening in 2023, 2024, and to an extent mid of 2025. But after that, what started happening because of the longer shipping routes, new ships were bought by those shipping giants like Mayors and whatnot, and that led to overcapacity of the ships. Now, because of the overcapacity of ships and because the Suez route is starting to open slowly because of the less disruptions by groups like the Houthis, it is leading to crashing of prices of the logistics and the shipping containers. Yes. And also because I told you that in 2022, when the Russia-Ukraine war had started, the crude oil had started getting traded every day at about $110 per blue barrel. This I was also mentioning that this has reduced to 60-70 now. Why did this happen? Because crude overproduction from the non-OPEC nations. Now, OPEC is a cartel. If anyone knows what a cartel means, a cartel is basically when a group of suppliers, they join hands to decide and monopolize the market by deciding the supply costs that they'll be charging from the people who want to buy that commodity. And commodities like oil, they are very important. Every single nation needs them. So OPEC is one of the largest and the most strongest and one of the largest, richest, strongest cartels globally, and they decide the oil prices majorly. But there are many non-OPEC nations, which are very large producers of oil as well, like USA, Brazil, Guyana. They started increasing their oil production, and because of that, the oil prices have reduced a lot now also. So, of course, this is connected to the Russia-Ukraine war in the sense that that had also led to increase in oil prices, and this crisis also had also led to increase in oil prices. Yes, overproduction from non-OPEC nations, and of course, reduced demand from China as well. This is linked to the, I won't say Chinese economic crisis, but definitely a Chinese economic slowdown, because GDP growth of China has reduced to about 4 to 5% annual from 9 to 10% earlier. So, of course, 4 to 5% annual GDP growth with a base of $18 trillion is definitely not slow at all. And India can only hope to achieve a similar level of GDP, even though India's growth is about 7.5% right now. But of course, it definitely is a slowdown from China's earlier growth rates of 9 to 10%. Yes, and of course, reduced demand has led to oversupply. That is leading to reduced prices of crude oil, as I was mentioning earlier. If we look at the Gaza conflict from the perspective of India, there have been some strategic wins in the sense that, of course, we should not engage in Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude माने किसी और की बुराई पर खुद फायदा लेके खुश होना नहीं करना चाहिए, but that's what happened. Because of the Israel-Gaza conflict, about more than 1 lakh working visas of Gaza citizens who had been working in Israel were cancelled. That led to a large vacuum of blue-collar jobs in Israel, into which the Indian government is sending its own people, in the sense Indian citizens. So this labor market arbitrage is being used to India's advantage. And other than that, India has also strengthened its defense and tech relations with Israel, because Israel is also called a startup nation. So, for example, just a small example off the top of my head. Currently, I think India has about 120 unicorns, and we have a population of 1.4 billion people. Israel has a population of, I think, 90 lakh or 1 crore people, and it has close to 90 unicorns, 90. The number is comparable when the population is almost 1 by 100 times, like point, that's what, that's 1%? Yes. So yeah, you can imagine the tech innovation importance that Israel gives to its economy. So of course, the defense and tech relations are improving. If we look at the strategic challenges that have arisen for India, because of the Gaza conflict. So yes, I'll talk about IIMEC later. Diplomatic tightrope. Why diplomatic tightrope? Basically means that India has been supporting the Palestinian cause of nationhood since 1947. And is India also recognized Israel very early on, 1947-48. Of course, the full diplomatic relations were established later on, but India did recognize the establishment of Israeli state. So India has had good relations with both Israel and Palestine. And because of this conflict, because of the increased tensions between the two, it has become a little difficult for India to walk the diplomatic tightrope कि हम किसका साथ दें. तो हम क्या करते हैं, हम dehyphenate करके चलते हैं दोनों के issues. Dehyphenate का मतलब we pursue the relations of India with Israel on a separate for its separate advantages, for which we pursue the relations of India with Palestine. दोनों के अलग फायदे हम देखते हैं, हम उनको हाइफनेट नहीं करते. हाइफनेट मतलब साथ में नहीं देखते हैं कि हाँ अगर इजराइल को हम सपोर्ट कर रहे हैं तो इसका मतलब ये कि हम पैलेस्टीन को नीचे दिखा रहे हैं, ऐसा नहीं है. तो इसलिए whenever not all the time, but yeah, most of the times when the Indian Prime Minister goes to meet Benjamin Netanyahu, that is the Prime Minister of Israel, he also meets the leader of the Palestinian Authority. So that is a way of walking the diplomatic tightrope. उसके अलावा Suez vulnerability, of course, increased the trading costs for India as well when the war was in its earlier stages. The Gaza conflict was in its earlier stages, and it disrupted IMEC indefinitely. IMEC क्या है? IMEC बता देता हूँ जल्दी से. IMEC is again a corridor only. So this is Mumbai, this is Saudi, this is UAE, Dubai, this is Israel, this is Italy, here it's Greece. So the IMEC basically is India, Middle East to Europe economic corridor. So this was the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. So of course you can see that it passes through Israel, and because of the Israel-Gaza conflict, the IMEC corridor was indefinitely disrupted. It has still not resumed, and because of that, it has reduced the possibilities of increasing trade of India with these nations that come in the way. So, of course, as soon as the Gaza conflict subsides, this will be definitely one of the highest priorities that India will be giving to any of the international initiatives that it is a part of. Now, if we see the way forward, because of the disruption of IMEC, India EU trade, European Union trade, this is EU nations, India EU trade could not be increased as much. Hence, India EU FTA should be leveraged. So basically, the India EU FTA was signed, I think, a few days back. It was signed, but it has not been implemented. It will take at least a year to get implemented, but it has been signed. And it is one of the largest trade agreements anywhere globally. I'll talk about it later in detail. So India should definitely leverage this and increase the trade with European nations so that the IMEC disruption does not act as a final problem. Basically, it should be resolved. The negative repercussions should be resolved. And going ahead, of course, there needs to be a dehyphenation. We need to continue with that policy of dehyphenation, as I was mentioning earlier, that we need to increase the humanitarian soft power with Palestine by giving them aid, by giving them any support in international organizations like the UN that they need. But of course, along with that, we need to pursue the defense hard power with Israel also, because defense and security issues are non-negotiable for the purposes of national security of any nation. I think that is it with the Gaza conflict and Red Sea issue also. So, any doubts? जल्दी जल्दी बताओ, बढ़ते हैं आगे पे. Syndicate. Soham Ghosh, yeah, what's the doubt?
Yes, so I don't have a doubt like as such, but considering all these facts, can you please give some opinion as to which country do you think has the more justified reason for whatever they're saying? They like each of them have presented a reason like for what they have done in regards to this conflict. So which one of them would you consider more justified reason for whatever is happening?
ओके, गुड पॉइंट. तो अच्छा, ये स्टार्टिंग में ही बोला था ना योर ओपिनियन बताने का. तो हाँ, आई थिंक दैट ये चीज आई हैव डेफिनेटली टोल्ड कि व्हाट इज द साइड ऑफ each of the parties, ki where each party stands. But going ahead, what should be the way forward and who's more justified? I think that we have to look at this from the perspective of India only, because हम उन countries के बैठ के उनके issues पे उनके स्टैंडर्ड्स के हिसाब से वही बोल सकते हैं जो वो खुद बोल रहे हैं. यूक्रेन के लिए दे आर मोस्ट जस्टिफाइड, रशिया के लिए दे आर मोस्ट जस्टिफाइड. सो इफ वी हैव टू लुक एट अ वे फॉरवर्ड, वी कैन ओनली टेल इट फ्रॉम द पर्सपेक्टिव ऑफ इंडिया एंड ग्लोबल पीस, विच इज अगेन द स्टैंड ऑफ इंडिया कि ग्लोबल पीस शुड बी द एंड वे फॉरवर्ड. तो वहां पे अगर हम यूक्रेन कॉन्फ्लिक्ट का देखेंगे, द ओनली वे फॉरवर्ड दैट और स्टैंड दैट वी कैन गिव इज दैट key solutions cannot be found on the battlefield, as the Prime Minister himself noted. There needs to be diplomacy, there needs to be understanding, and then things need to be negotiated with all the parties and all the stakeholders in a single room. That's what is being tried right now. So if, for example, the interviewer asks you that what should be the way forward with the Ukraine conflict, the only thing you can say is these things. What the Indian government itself has said, that the solutions cannot be found on the battlefield because it will only lead to more and more casualties of soldiers and civilians, as well as destruction of infrastructure. Going ahead, the only way forward is through peace negotiations and settling the issues through diplomacy and talking between the main two leaders. And of course, India can act as a peace broker also, because it has been able to maintain reasonable ties with both the parties. Similarly, if we have to talk about the Gaza conflict, I think यहाँ पे हम ये बोल सकते हैं that the Trump's 20-point peace proposal is actually a good way to at least start the discussions between the two parties of Hamas and Israel. Going ahead, वही जैसे मैं पहले बोला था, the only way forward is through peace and dialogue and negotiations, because otherwise it can only lead to more humanitarian crisis, larger number of civilian casualties, which is not in the benefit of anyone. हाँ, तो बेसिकली मेरा पॉइंट वो है कि इंटरनेशनल क्राइसिस कभी भी होते हैं ना, तो ऑलवेज जो वे फॉरवर्ड तुम्हें देना है वो, हाउ डू आई पुट इट, resort to the most basic principles of what a rules-based order is like. And that is comprised only of peace negotiations, diplomacy, dialogue, and people-to-people ties, increasing convergences, trade, एंड इकोनॉमिक रिलेशंस, यही सारी चीजें जो हैं वो वॉर को अल्टीमेटली रिड्यूस करती हैं. उसके अलावा you can only say that of course India, if it has good ties with both the sides, can also act as a peace broker. Should we always not side and just say pros and cons? या नहीं, वो क्वेश्चन पे डिपेंड करेगा. इफ देयर फॉर एग्जांपल इफ द क्वेश्चन पॉइंटेडली आस्क्स व्हाट डू यू थिंक आर सम ऑफ द पॉजिटिव्स दैट इंडिया हैज derived after the Ukraine conflict, you can list these things, that we got discounted crude oil. You can list these things, that India was able to perhaps increase its soft power in the sense that only Prime Minister Modi is one of the few leaders in the world that is on talking terms with both the parties. Hence we can act as a peace broker also, like I was mentioning. So we focus on the question. And if of course the question is like what are the pros and cons that the globe is facing after the Ukraine war, you can list that कि pros क्या हैं, cons क्या हैं. cons बहुत ज्यादा हैं, pros थोड़े कम हैं, but हाँ हैं, definitely हैं. Can you enlist which trade routes are crucial for India and any threats etc associated with them? Trade routes. Okay, trade routes तो यार I would say, see, this is India, right? This is Sri Lanka. This is Sri Lanka. यहाँ से जितने भी strategic choke points हैं यहाँ पे, if this is Indonesia, we have the Malacca Strait here. So straits are basically very tiny, very narrow water bodies surrounded by land on two sides. So if this is water and this is land, this is land, this is a strait. There's a Malacca Strait here. There is the Bab el Mandeb Strait. There is the Hormuz Strait. All these are important trade routes for India, and the security of all these trade routes is absolutely of utmost importance for Indian trade. And यहाँ पे इसलिए Indian Navy generally ensures that these sea lanes of communication are secure. And यहाँ पे जो भी humanitarian work होता है, piracy की anti piracy operations होते हैं, all of these are being taken, the responsibility of all of these lies with the Indian Navy. And of course Indian Navy खुद voluntarily करती है to ensure that the trade routes are secured. And if you're talking about the threats associated with them, in the west, this is the Arabian Sea. तो यहाँ पे this area is called the Horn of Africa. तो Horn of Africa के पास piracy issues बहुत होते हैं, because यहाँ पे सोमालिया कंट्री, सोमालियन पायरेट्स बहुत होते हैं. उसके अलावा as I was mentioning, this is the Red Sea. तो Red Sea में there was bombing being done by the Houthis, तो that is being reduced now. तो that was a threat. उसके अलावा चाइना का अगर ले लेते हैं, there is being increased strategic presence of China in the entire Indian Ocean region. This is the Indian Ocean region ना. तो यहाँ पे चाइना का presence बढ़ रहा है, be it in Sri Lanka, be it in Myanmar, be it in of course Pakistan तो है ही. तो to tackle that, India is also trying to increase its overseas presence in other nations, and hence we have what we call them logistics exchange agreements, where the Indian military can access military facilities of other nations in the region. So we have logistics exchange agreements with many countries, like यहाँ पे फ्रांस का एक छोटा सा आइलैंड है, रियूनियन आइलैंड, तो we have a logistics exchange agreement with France. यहाँ पे ऑस्ट्रेलिया है, ऑस्ट्रेलिया के कुछ आइलैंड्स हैं यहाँ पे इंडियन ओशन में, we have a logistics exchange agreement with Australia also. Along with that we have access to this is Oman यहाँ पे. तो ओमान का एक पोर्ट है डुकुम पोर्ट पे we have military access facilities का access. Along with that यहाँ पे okay, बांग्लादेश में we don't, हाँ of course we have Andaman Nicobar and Lakshadweep हैं यहाँ पे दोनों साइड, तो there also we have our military bases. So the security of these trade routes is being ensured through these. I think that is more or less it. हम आगे बढ़ जाते हैं जल्दी से. Trump 2.0 in Indian economy. This is also थोड़ा सा बड़ा टॉपिक है. So what exactly is happening? Trump 2.0 means Trump का second presidency that started in 2024 नहीं 5. This will end in January से start हुआ था, Jan 2025 से Jan 2029 होगा. The term is 24 to 28. He was elected in end of 2024. So what exactly is happening with Trump 2.0? So Trump 2.0 is a little different with from Trump 1.0, which was 2016 to 2020. So Trump 2.0 is more inward looking, and okay, Donroe Doctrine I'll discuss later. It is more hyper nationalist. What does hyper nationalist mean? So nationalism is basically again an inward looking ideology where you see that your country is the primary nation that you need to take care of, and it sort of is a supremacist ideology also, that we are somehow better than other countries. So this is what the MAGA ideology is, Make America Great Again. कि we are the best and no one can compete with us, no one can be equal to us, and we will try and ensure that for nothing important we need to depend on other countries, हम खुद सब कुछ करेंगे. So it's also again internal looking. इसके बाद है autarkic. So autarky is a economic ideology which again means self-sufficiency. So it was a property of some of the authoritarian states earlier. So if you look at just before Second World War, the German economy and the Italian economies, these were being led by very hardcore authoritarian leaders like Hitler and Mussolini. इनका मेन आइडिया होता कि we need to ensure autarkic economies so that we do not have to depend on for anything on other countries. Of course, that's not practically possible in modern globalized nations, modern globalized economy, but हाँ, it's an ideology which is being pursued by Donald Trump also. And for that, for example, AI को लेके उनका वो स्टारगेट इनिशिएटिव आया, $500 बिलियन का इन्वेस्टमेंट करेंगे एआई के लिए. उसके अलावा आई थिंक ओपन एआई वाज टॉकिंग अबाउट अ $3 ट्रिलियन इन्वेस्टमेंट फॉर एआई. तो ये सब क्या है? ये सब बेसिकली उसका एम वही है कि एआई की सारी सप्लाई चेन फ्रॉम ए टू जेड वी नीड टू एस्टैब्लिश विद इन यूएसए. ट्रम्प 2.0 इज मोर ट्रांजैक्शनलिस्ट. मोर ट्रांजैक्शनलिस्ट का मतलब I can only give you benefit as long as you give me benefit. अगर मेरे को तुमसे कोई फायदा नहीं है तो I do not care about you at all. And that's what Trump did. थोड़ा सा ट्रम्प 1.0 के टाइम पे भी था, ट्रम्प 2.0 के टाइम में ये और बढ़ गया. एंड उसका बेस्ट एग्जांपल है कि ट्रम्प आते ही आई थिंक और अप्रैल में he put 25% blanket tariffs on every single export of India to USA because उनको बस इतना दिख गया कि इंडिया का ट्रेड सरप्लस है यूएस के कंपैरिजन में, यूएस के साथ, which is about $40 billion or something like that. So that means the Indian exports to USA are hurting the US economy. Hence, we need to put the tariffs. So उन्होंने blanket tariffs लगा दिए 25%. That means transactionalism. उसके अलावा more pragmatic and realistic भी है, of course. Idealistic principles कम है ट्रम्प के, जो कि of course फायदा भी कर रहे हैं यूएस को. They are more clear-eyed with respect to their strategic adversarial stance against China. They are more clear-eyed with respect to what their priorities are. For example, as I was about to tell, US की national security strategy आई है 2025 में. The US national security strategy for 2025 explicitly reduces the focus of the US foreign policy into the Western Hemisphere. They have limited their focus on Western Hemisphere. Of course, they're not saying that they won't care about the rest of the world at all. They're just saying that they'll focus more on the Western Hemisphere. And this is can be said a Trump, यार अब वो ये history में नहीं जाते. So there was a president of US called I think his surname was Monroe, I'm forgetting the first name. This was early 1820s. He was the first one to limit US strategic presence in the Western Hemisphere, and his idea was that US did not want any of the European colonial powers colonizing any country in the Western Hemisphere, be it in North America or South America, including the South American, Latin American nations. Hence, this is like a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine meaning that इसको बस बोल देते हैं Monroe Doctrine. This is not an official word. This is just like a media given term. But yeah, it makes sense in the sense that Trump is trying to bring that policy again, but with more resources. Of course, US was not a preeminent superpower in the 1820s as it is now. So this Monroe Doctrine is trying to focus more on increasing US strategic convergences with countries in North America and South America, and also trying to ensure that no other country, primarily China, has any influence of China and Russia has any influence on any of the nations in the Western Hemisphere. Yeah, that's the Monroe Doctrine. So that's why it's more inward looking. Okay, this is the basic idea of what Trump 2.0 stands for. Now, if we look at the main issues that have arisen with India, with first of one being trade tariff and reciprocal escalation. So as I mentioned, 25% blanket tariffs, and these tariffs were further increased in August 2025 to 50% for many of the significant items, not for everything, but many of the significant items. So and these key sectors, many of them have actually taken a hit where the exports have reduced. I'll come to the sectors that have actually faced this issue. And of course, like Trump ji ka single logic ये था कि we are funding Ukraine war by buying Russian oil. And उन्होंने वो चीज ध्यान नहीं दिया कि US itself was actually buying nuclear fuel from Russia. And of course, the European nations are dependent on Russian natural gas more than India is dependent on Russian crude. And of course, that European nations themselves were buying refined crude oil products from India, and these refined crude oil products had initially come from Russia. Of course, Europe could have stopped buying any of these things, but they did not. But उन पे tariff नहीं लगा, हम पे लग गया. So yeah, that's how Mr. Trump functions anyway. So like of course you'll find many double standards and hypocrisy here, and of course India is not the largest buyer of Russian crude even now. China is, but China पे tariffs उतने नहीं लगे हैं, and of course क्योंकि China ने retaliate किया तो decrease हो गए हैं tariffs दोनों पे. Okay. And of course like US demands that India pivot towards energy sources of the USA, because US is also quite a large producer of both natural gas and crude oil. So, there have been some substantial tariffs on the Indian economy, and of course, many of the, as I was mentioning earlier, there have been some. Yes, China stopped semiconductor chips, and China also retaliated by increasing tariffs tariffs on US exports to China. So, I think US and China, if you need to remember this, that US and China are the two primary superpowers in the globe right now. Of course, US is much farther ahead of China in most of the things, but yes, China is the only possible strategic competitor to USA. They are the biggest strategic adversaries, and they are the two biggest trade partners also. US-China trade equals somewhere about $1 trillion, and the trade deficit of USA with China is more than $300-400 billion. But US again came at India's neck, even though the trade deficit was only $35-36 billion with India. Anyway, because they could. That's the only reason, because they could. So going ahead, of course, India needs to increase its hard power in terms of economic strength, as well as military strategy, defense and security policies, research and innovation, science and tech, space, deep tech, everything. Okay, moving on. Yeah, moving on. If we look at these trade and tariffs were put on India, but there have been some I would say positive externalities of these trade tariffs on India as well. सबसे पहले क्या है? It has pushed India to reform internally. So what was the main selling point of Indian exports? कि we produced at less cost, we produced at cheap cost. So now think, and US is still one of the biggest export markets for India. The India-US trade is close to $200 billion. 200, including the service trade, of course, not just the goods trade. So $200 billion is quite a big trade, and we had about $35-36 billion surplus with the USA. So the cost advantage has reduced because US has put tariffs on our exports to USA. If our cost benefit is being reduced, it will force Indian producers to become more efficient, to innovate, to actually produce good quality and not just at a cheaper cost. बिकॉज हाँ मतलब चीपर कॉस्ट एक चीज है, बट अब चीपर कॉस्ट का फायदा चला गया तो हमें बाकी चीजों में इनोवेट करना पड़ेगा टू मेक आवरसेल्फ कंपेटिटिव. तो दिस हैज पुश्ड इंटरनल रिफॉर्म not just of the private producers but of the government as well. And for example, the budget has come today. If you look at the budget speech, there has been customs simplification. The customs procedures have simplified to increase the liberalization of trade, Indian economy trading with the world. Along with that, many of the sectors have actually got duty-free inputs. So ऐसा एक चीज होती है जिसको बोलते हैं inverted duty mechanism. So GST is there on raw materials, GST is there on finished products as well. Let's assume I'm a small bicycle maker and मेरे को टायर का जो रबर है वो चाइना से इंपोर्ट करना पड़ता है. अगर मेरा टायर का रबर जो मैं चाइना से इंपोर्ट कर रहा हूँ उस पर 18% GST है एंड मेरे जो फाइनल साइकिल है उस पर 5% GST है, तो जो मेरे को फाइनल 5% GST है वो तो मेरे को इनपुट टैक्स क्रेडिट में मिल गया, लेकिन मैंने जो 18% GST भरा है रॉ मटेरियल पे वो मेरे को वापस नहीं मिला होती आसानी से. सो जो ये डिफरेंस है कि रॉ मटेरियल्स आर मोर एक्सपेंसिव from compared to the finished products, this is called an inverted duty mechanism. Inverted duty mechanism reduces the competitiveness of Indian exports. So duty free imports agar hain to that will remove the problem of this inverted duty structure. And inverted duty structure ka and this duty free imports for many of the sectors has been implemented recently also. So the Trump tariffs, because our the export competitiveness of Indian products will reduce because of the higher costs in US market, it is also promoting internal reform, which is a positive thing. And yes, as I mentioned, efficiency and innovation, since the cost arbitrage reduces. And this is being implemented through schemes like PLI, Production Linked Incentive Scheme. I'll talk about this in detail later on. And of course, it has also pushed for self-reliance of the Indian economy and trying to make as much raw materials in the country as well. And that is also leading to missions like the Indian Semiconductor Mission 2.0. We are trying to make semiconductor chips inside the country only so that we do not have to depend on other nations. Of course, and this is also pushing market diversification. As I mentioned, US is still one of the largest export markets for India, but it does not mean that we cannot explore other countries also. The European Union, we need to remember that European Union as whole, like it comprises of 29, 30 countries. As a whole, the European Union is almost a $25 trillion economy, like the EU in its entirety. And that means it's a very huge market as well. So the India-EU free trade agreement that was signed about a week ago, that is a very big boon. And this market diversification that we are trying to explore by going towards European markets, by going towards Latin American markets, by going towards African markets, this was pushed also because of the US tariffs on Indian exports. कि हमें US में महंगे पड़ रहे हैं तो हम बाकी मार्केट्स में जाके देखेंगे. So that is good. Latin America, Africa, India, UFTA, etc., etc. India, UFTA, just a small point, which, and I think if you can mention these metrics in your interview answer somewhere, it will be good. Why the India UFTA is being lauded so much by industry players, both from India and the European countries. It creates a 2 billion strong market, 1.4 billion people of India, along with 700, 800 million people of the EU nations. So it creates an integrated market of almost 200 crore people, along with 25% of the global GDP. India accounts for about 8% of the global GDP, if I'm remembering it correctly, and EU already accounts for about 15 to 16% of the global GDP. So in total, about 25% of the global GDP, quite a big number. Okay. Of course, because of the trade and tariff reciprocal escalation by USA, there have been some cons as well. And वो main issues वही है कि a lot of the exports in India. So this is something that you need to remember. MSMEs, India MSMEs means micro, small and medium enterprises. Definition होती है उनकी कि 250 crore से कम turnover वाले. There is a government portal for registering MSMEs. India has registered about 6.5 crore MSMEs. So you can imagine the amount of people employed by these companies, by these small companies. They account for 30% of Indian GDP, along with 45% of goods exports. They are absolutely instrumental in the functioning of the Indian economy. तो वही है कि Indian economy सिर्फ TCS, Wipro, Reliance, ये बड़ी बड़ी कंपनीज नहीं है, ये 6.5 करोड़ छोटी कंपनीज, they are responsible for 45% of goods exports and 30% of Indian GDP. That's quite a lot. So ये जो MSME companies हैं, they are not able to generally absorb these higher costs. That is actually right now also because of the tariffs by the Americans. It is actually leading to shutdown of many of the MSME clusters also of certain sectors, not of all sectors, of certain sectors, and वो जो sectors हैं, I'll come to those. उसके अलावा of these sectors that I'm mentioning now, so the sectors that are being affected most, especially from the MSME sector also, they are low margin, high labor sectors. And low margin, high labor का मतलब वही होता है कि उनके profits कम होते हैं and the number of people they employing are a lot. And ये कौन से होते हैं? Textiles. Textiles के साथ textiles, leather, footwear, gems and jewelry, diamond, जो सूरत में industry है, it has actually faced quite a lot of problems because of the US tariffs. उसके अलावा gems and jewelry incidentally are also one of the largest export items of the Indian goods basket. So all of these sectors, इनके जो especially lower sectors, like lower छोटी companies हैं, MSMEs, they are facing quite a lot of issues. And of course, the competitors which have not actually faced these high tariffs, Bangladesh, textiles, Vietnam electronics, they are competing with the Indian exports into the USA. And of course, like I mentioned earlier also, whenever there is such a trade disruption, whenever there is a trade war with USA generally, because then it leads to a default depreciation pressure on the INR in the Indian market. Why does this happen? I'll tell you why. Most of the foreign capital, a large source of the foreign capital for the entire world, FDI, FPI, both, they come from USA, because USA, there are a lot of rich people there. Let's face it. They have I think more than 1-2 lakh millionaires. And because of the large amount of capital there, a lot of the foreign investment into various, especially the developing nations, comes from the USA. And if there is any country which goes towards a trade war with USA, these generally investors which are from the US, they take their money out of these countries and go back to safe assets like the US Treasury bonds. Treasury bonds means government bonds. I think I mentioned it earlier also, just to clarify the doubt. So that, of course, whenever there is a removal of dollars from the Indian market, it leads to depreciation pressure on the Indian rupee, and because of the capital flight. And of course, I mentioned earlier, whenever there is a depreciation pressure on the Indian rupee, the market corrects itself, and that leads to increased export competitiveness of India. Yes, but since India is an import-dependent economy, it leads to imported inflation. And yes, whenever there is such a trade war, India becomes constrained to actually compromise on its strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy means carrying out our foreign policy in a way that does not take care of interests of any other country except ourselves. Basically, जब हम खुद की मर्जी से अपनी फॉरेन पॉलिसी चला रहे होते हैं, we call that strategic autonomy. But whenever there is such क्या बोलते हैं उसको, arm twisting कह लो, या फिर जबरदस्ती करते हैं ऐसे कंट्रीज बाकी के, and of course we can't deny that USA is a big country and it is one of the largest trade partners of India as well. We will have to compromise somewhere or the other. जो कि जो फ्री ट्रेड अग्रीमेंट है उसके जो उसका डिस्कशन चल रहा है उसमें ये चीजें बात हो रही हैं. In such a way, we compromise on our strategic autonomy a bit, which is a very core fundamental principle of the Indian foreign and economic policy. So that is also negative. So what should be the way forward for us? If we look at the way forward, of course, it needs to be balanced. But yes, it's a general suggestion for any policy-based question. If it comes in the interview, you can club your way forwards into short-term, medium-term, या फिर short-term and long-term. तो शॉर्ट टर्म में यहाँ पे अगर हम देखें तो वी नीड टू नेगोशिएट विद यूएस फॉर एनर्जी परचेस टारगेट्स, बिकॉज इट माइट बी पॉसिबल दैट द एनर्जी वी आर गेटिंग फ्रॉम अदर कंट्रीज वी आर एबल टू गेट दैट फ्रॉम यूएस एट सिमिलर प्राइसेस आल्सो. तो अगर हमें ज्यादा नुकसान नहीं हो रहा है तो वी कैन शिफ्ट आवर एनर्जी सोर्सेज टू यूएसए, थोड़ा सा ट्रम्प को खुश करने के लिए ही चाहे, मतलब खुश करना इज द रॉन्ग वर्ड, बट येस टू कॉम्प्रोमाइज अ बिट सो दैट दे कैन गिव अस सम बेनिफिट्स आल्सो. And yes, of course, India-US FTA discussions are going on. And if we look at the long-term aspect of this, how to navigate the pressure with the USA in the long term, we need to increase our service exports even more. And because service exports are a little difficult to tax, because जो ये tariff, जितने भी हम tariff trade barriers की बात करते हैं, mainly they are on goods exports. मतलब वो है ना कि they are paid on at the customs when the goods are removed from the ships and go into the customs borders of the country. But service exports, they don't क्रॉस द बॉर्डर, वो ऑनलाइन होते हैं, तो सर्विस एक्सपोर्ट्स पे टैरिफ नहीं लग सकते. इट्स डिफिकल्ट टू टैरिफ सर्विस एक्सपोर्ट्स, तो हेंस वी नीड टू इंक्रीज आवर सर्विस एक्सपोर्ट्स इवन मोर. ऑफ कोर्स वी आर increasing them quite a lot already. TCS, Wipro, जो ये Infosys type companies are, they are exporting a lot of BPO and information technology services to the USA. BPO is business process outsourcing, but yes, we need to increase them even more. उसके अलावा we need to push research and innovation, research and development, so that the exports that India produces for the various countries, including USA, they become so important for the target nations also that they are not able to tariff them. For example, India के जो pharma exports हैं, US has not been able to tariff them because उनकी अपनी दवाइयां महंगी हो रही हैं. अगर वो इंडिया के एक्सपोर्ट्स को टैरिफ करेंगे, यूएस ने फार्मा एक्सपोर्ट्स में ब्रांडेड मेडिसिन को पर टैरिफ लगाया, बट इंडिया के मेजॉरिटी एक्सपोर्ट्स ऑफ मेडिसिन टू द यूएसए आर जेनेरिक मेडिसिन. सो जेनेरिक मेडिसिन जो इसलिए दैट्स अ रीजन व्हाई द फार्मा सेक्टर हैज नॉट बीन हिट दैट बैडली. सो दैट उसका रीजन क्या है? बिकॉज दीज आर सो इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर द यूएस इकोनॉमी एज वेल. हेंस वी नीड टू पुश R&D, research innovation of our own private sector also, so that the exports we produce are important for the host nations as well, and R&D and deep tech of course. And of course, like as I mentioned, alternative markets को explore करना बहुत जरूरी है, and for that we are also signing free trade agreements with many countries. For example, India has signed a CEPA. So CEPA is like a comprehensive free trade agreement, full form छोड़ो, UAE के साथ है, and यूरोपियन यूनियन का फ्री ट्रेड अग्रीमेंट भी है. Okay, just to mention, CEPA का अगर हम थोड़ा सा डिफरेंस देखें फ्रॉम जनरल FTA, CEPA इज लाइक कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव इकोनॉमिक पार्टनरशिप अग्रीमेंट. CEPA में जनरली इन्वेस्टमेंट्स भी कवर्ड होते हैं. सो जनरली व्हेन वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट फ्री ट्रेड अग्रीमेंट्स, दे डू नॉट cover regulation of investment from the countries between each other nations, but generally जो ये CEPA होती हैं, they cover investments also. तो investment protection का मतलब बताता हूँ जल्दी से. Investment protection का मतलब होता है, let's say if foreign investor is coming to India, so there are some investment regulations that a large amount of foreign investment that comes into India एकदम से वो निकाल के बाहर नहीं लेके जा सकते हैं. उस पे कुछ restrictions हैं, because that involves that reduces the volatility of investments into the country. Because अगर सारा पैसा कभी भी ले जाओ कभी भी ले आओ, तो that leads to volatility. So there are some restrictions. But when these CEPA type agreements are signed, which also cover protection of the investment, जो ये undue restrictions होते हैं investments पे, ये कम कर देते हैं. So the capital inflow and outflow between these two nations improves, मतलब eases, not improves, eases. So आसान हो जाता है लाना इधर उधर. Anyway, moving on. Okay, trade tariff reciprocal escalation के बाद the next issue between India and USA because of Trump 2.0 is the H1B crisis, and it's actually a crisis because there was this proposal that was implemented in September 1 from September 1, 2025 onwards, where $100,000 fee has been put for new H1B visas that is to be paid by the employers. Of course, like अगर मैं जा रहा हूँ तो मैं नहीं पे करूंगा, बट अगर मेरे को इन्फोसिस यूएस का ब्रांच एम्प्लॉय कर रहा है तो उसको पे करना पड़ेगा मेरे को वहां लाने के लिए. तो ऑफकोर्स उनके लिए जो कॉस्ट है वो बहुत ज्यादा बढ़ गई. दैट विल प्रमोट देम रिक्रूटिंग द लोकल्स देयर. दिस इज द एंटायर आइडिया बिहाइंड दिस. सो yes, so yeah, first of all, this is an NTB का मतलब क्या होता है? नॉन टैरिफ बैरियर. सो या एज आई वाज मेंशनिंग, जो ये टैरिफ वगैरह चीजें हैं ये लगती हैं गुड्स पे, तो सर्विस एक्सपोर्ट्स को रिड्यूस करने के लिए दिस इज अ वेरी गुड थिंग. इट्स अ नॉन टैरिफ बैरियर. नॉन टैरिफ बैरियर मतलब a barrier to trade which is not tax. So it's a non-tariff, non-tax barrier to trade. So yes, of course, this has pros and cons for India both. Cons definitely वही हैं कि जो इंडिया के सर्विस एक्सपोर्ट्स हैं through companies like Infosys, TCS वगैरह, these will be hit, no doubt about that. कितने हिट होंगे पता नहीं, अभी चल रहा है वो भी, क्योंकि अभी 3 महीने हुए हैं इम्प्लीमेंट हुए. बट yes, these will be hit. उसके अलावा many of the people used to see employment in global MNCs as living the American dream. तो वो जो American dream का आइडिया था, either by studying there or doing a job there, that will be reduced. So job in education destination जो है वो opportunity कम हो गई. उसके अलावा see, India gets $130 billion in remittances every year. Remittances means the Indian citizens of Indian origin, people of Indian origin living abroad, they send this much money annually to India. It is contributing to the Indian economy quite a lot. $130 billion छोटा पैसा नहीं होता है. It's almost 3% of the Indian GDP. तो जो रेमिटेंस है, ऑफ कोर्स ये लॉन्ग टर्म की बात है, बट जो रेमिटेंस इनफ्लोज हैं फ्रॉम यूएसए टू इंडिया, दे विल रिड्यूस बिकॉज नंबर ऑफ इंडियन एम्प्लॉइज माइट नॉट इंक्रीज एज मच गोइंग अहेड. Yes, these are the cons. Balance of payment. यार आई थिंक इतना ना डिटेल में शायद जरूरत नहीं है, तो आई एम स्किपिंग बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट का भी, क्योंकि बहुत ज्यादा ना टाइम लग जाएगा. अगर एंड में किसी को डाउट हो तो पूछ लेना. बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट आई विल एक्सप्लेन व्हाट इट इज. प्रोज ऑफ इंडिया. प्रोज फॉर इंडिया क्या है? ऑफ कोर्स लाइक H1B visas means the mobility of Indian labor, Indian talented labor towards USA has reduced. इससे कुछ फायदा होगा. सबसे पहला फायदा क्या? जो ब्रेन ड्रेन है, कहां गया? जो ब्रेन ड्रेन है, ऑफ कोर्स दैट विल रिड्यूस. रिवर्स ब्रेन ड्रेन भी हो जाएगा इनफैक्ट टू एन एक्सटेंट, बिकॉज इनफैक्ट मेनी ऑफ द पीपल हु आर वर्किंग देयर ऑन नॉन H1B visas, बट जिनका H1B का होने वाला था, उनको अब H1B वीजा में इशू होगा. तो दे माइट कम बैक टू इंडिया विद देयर इंक्रीज ह्यूमन कैपिटल. मतलब उनका जो दिमाग बढ़ा है वहां जाके, बहुत सारे उन्होंने अच्छी चीजें करी है सिलिकॉन वैली में, दे माइट कम एंड इंप्लीमेंट दोस इन इंडिया. सो दैट इज अ रिवर्स ब्रेन ड्रेन, विच इज अ पॉजिटिव. उसके अलावा ऑफ कोर्स बिकॉज many of the US companies also, which were bringing Indian talented professionals from India to USA on the H1B visas, they will start facing cost issues, and of course जो cost arbitrage था of hiring an Indian worker there, that has reduced because of this exorbitant H1B fee. They are actually shifting their headquarters to India also to take benefit of the Indian talent, and that is why there is a very strong boom in the global capability centers that are being established in the country, the GCCs. The GCCs are offshoring to Bengaluru, Hyderabad jaise centers, which is definitely a positive. And of course, because as I was mentioning, जो ये labor arbitrage है, the labor cost arbitrage, the labor cost difference that was there, that was actually promoting the employment of Indian youth, talented youth in USA. That will lead to forced innovation and reform within the country, so that इतने सारे लोगों को वहां जाने की जरूरत ना पड़े in the first case. So forced reform innovation अगर इंडिया में होने लगा, तो इंडिया में ही अच्छी deep tech STEM jobs, STEM quality jobs जो हैं वो produce होने लगेंगी. लोगों को बाहर कम जाना पड़ेगा. That's obviously definitely a good point for Indian economy going ahead. And of course, how do we see the way forward? It needs to be very pragmatic and realistic. And वही है कि जो first of all, the professionals that are coming back into India, they need to be gainfully employed. They need to be given proper opportunities. उसके लिए सिलिकॉन वैली टेंट को अट्रैक्ट करने के लिए प्रॉपर स्टार्टअप फंडिंग इंश्योर करो. एंड आई थिंक इसके लिए ही the government has started a deep tech policy also, not specifically targeted towards the people coming back, of course, but in general deep tech startups ki there is a policy which also has a provision where the government will actually become a VC, a venture capitalist for the deep tech startups. It's quite a good step. Uske alawa, the SEZs are special economic zones which have very less tax and tax holidays a lot, like they don't have to pay anything. So SEZs setting up new businesses in the special economic zones is quite easy. So the government can actively hunt for the talent that is coming back to India and move them towards the SEZs. That can actually help them increase the business in those nations, in those regions. Along with that, the India-US FTA, it has not been signed. It is being negotiated for quite some years now. So going ahead, the negotiations of the India-US FTA can actually include clauses on labor mobility also, where the government can perhaps take a quota so that, I don't know, 10K or 5K people every year go to USA on free H1B visas if possible. But yes, a labor mobility clause can definitely be seen as a part of the upcoming FTA. And India has actually made it a habit of including labor mobility clauses with most agreements, most free trade agreements that it signs, including one with the European Union. And also, it has, other than the FTAs, it has also signed labor mobility agreements with countries like France and Germany also, so that it promotes movement of Indian professionals to these nations. And yes, alternative destinations को promote करने की बहुत जरूरत है. Other than USA, for example, many of the European nations are also actually giving quite good deals in terms of reduced fees for studying in educational institutions there. And I was mentioning that labor mobility agreements, France के साथ, for example, जो labor mobility agreement, I think उसमें France has actually agreed to take 30,000 Indian students by 2030. So, of course, on scholarships. So that's a very good positive. We are promoting alternative destinations also, so that all of our human capital, Indian human capital, is not concentrated in one country like the USA, where they face issues when tumultuous presidents like President Trump come to power. I think that is more or less it. इसमें और कुछ है नहीं, आगे बढ़ जाते हैं. Okay, moving on to the next topic. It's a very short topic. The World Economic Forum. It is actually an annual summit that takes place in Davos, Switzerland. It's quite a beautiful ski town. I think you should look at the photos. And I think isme anyone can go if you pay a 15 lakh fee. So if you are rich enough, you guys can go also to network with heads of state and people like that. Anyway, so yeah, Davos, Switzerland takes place every year in January, generally. And what is it exactly? It is, like I said, it's a networking event, more or less, where heads of state, big industry leaders, commerce union ministers, state chief ministers, civil society networks, for example, many of the environmental groups, environmental justice groups, they all attend here, discuss policy issues. For example, I mentioned earlier that President Trump took the platform of Davos 10 days ago to launch his proposal for the Board of Peace for resolving global conflicts. I discussed that while we were discussing the Gaza crisis. So yeah, it's generally quite a good platform to showcase the competence of various nations, the importance of economies of various nations, and hence India has been quite active in the World Economic Forum for quite some time now, especially in post 2019. So this time we had the largest delegation ever that we've ever sent to the World Economic Forum, but we'll come to that later on. First, let's take a quick look at the global issues that were discussed. Firstly, the geo-economic confrontation taking place across the globe emerged as the #1 risk to the global economy, at least in the short term. That will be roughly before 2030. So geo-economic confrontation basically means that breaking or splitting of the global economy into blocks. Blocks, one being US-led and one being China-led. So the Western European nations, along with USA, some of the Latin American nations, they are somewhat in the US bloc, and some Southeast Asian nations, like some countries like Laos, Cambodia, along with Russia, they are the China-led bloc, along with the Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan as well. So this is leading to the splitting of the global economy. And what does the splitting of the global economy lead? It leads to inefficiencies. As I was mentioning earlier, the idea of just-in-time supply chains, where less time and low cost were the primary things that were being considered to ensure the security of global supply chains, they actually functioned because they had a benefit. They had a benefit that वो सस्ती थी और वो जल्दी काम करती थी. But now, because of the splitting of the global economy into different trade blocks, those efficient जो वो efficiencies थी, they will not be utilized as much. They will lead to inefficiencies. Inefficiencies will increase time of the supply chains. Inefficiencies will lead to higher costs of the supply chains, but they will lead to more security. That's why these are being promoted. More security in the sense that US की जो सारी supply chains है, they will be concentrated in friendly countries like Western European nations हो गए, कि अपने Latin American nations हो गए, etc. etc. उसके अलावा, of course, as I mentioned, Trump launched the Board of Peace, which is his way of shifting away from the UN-centric global order. But like many of the countries have rejected that also, including many of the European nations. Yes. Other than that, there was a discussion on artificial intelligence. So till last year, what we were seeing, we were seeing discussions more on the hype around artificial intelligence. Oh wow, AI ये भी कर देता है. Oh wow, AI ये कर रहा है. Oh ये AI कितना अच्छा कर रहा है. Now we are moving towards more pragmatic discussions regarding artificial intelligence on the policy issues. For example, what are the negatives that AI is going to cause? The negatives that AI are going to cause are those negatives short term? Are those negatives long term? What is the way forward to reduce the negatives of the that AI will be causing? Because there are a lot of positives about AI as well. AI will increase productivity. AI will increase GDP. AI will increase the resource efficiency of a lot of sectors, like almost every sector and industry you can think of. In fact, so there are a lot of pros, but the cons are not. They are there and they are inevitable. It will harm white collar jobs, especially in outsourcing hubs. And one of the largest outsourcing hubs, especially for service sector, is India. जो हमारे कॉलर एजेंट्स होते हैं, जो बीपीओ बिजनेस प्रोसेस आउटसोर्सिंग वगैरह जो इंडिया के बैक ऑफिस कर रहे हैं, a lot of that can be done with AI. That means these white collar jobs in outsourcing hubs like India, Philippines also, other Southeast Asian nations also, they will be harmed. Hence, what we need is reskilling, because it is important to understand that AI की वजह से जो unemployment होगा, that will be structural unemployment. So what is structural unemployment? Structural unemployment basically means there is a mismatch between the supply of workers and need of industry in terms of skills. Basically, in terms of skills, basically what that means is, बहुत अच्छा एग्जाम्पल है, इंडिया के बहुत सारे ग्रेजुएट्स राइट आफ्टर ग्रेजुएशन, मोस्ट ऑफ द कंपनीज व्हेन दे एम्प्लॉय दीज ग्रेजुएट्स, दे हैव एटलीस्ट 2 to 3 months स्किलिंग प्रोग्राम्स. क्यों? क्योंकि इंडियन ग्रेजुएट्स एम्प्लॉयबल नहीं होते. So that is what is that? That is structural unemployment. Structural unemployment means there's a mismatch between the skills required and the skills in supply. So, but structural unemployment is a problem because it will lead to unemployment. It's a form of unemployment. But the positive thing about structural unemployment is that it is temporary. It can be resolved by skilling. Simple. Skill करो आप. अगर वो ग्रेजुएट स्किल होके निकल रहे हैं तो ये जो स्ट्रक्चरल अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट का इशू है ये कम हो जाएगा. इफ द पीपल आर बीइंग रीस्किल्ड और अपस्किल्ड इन आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस एंड आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस रिलेटेड एप्लीकेशंस, the cause of structural employment, the issue of structural employment will reduce. Hence जो ये बहुत बड़ा there is a lot of hype and a negative hype also, like हवा बना रखा है AI का कि AI से ये हो जाएगा वो हो जाएगा. हो सकता है, we need to always remember, हो सकता है, but it might not also happen because it's a form of upskilling that can take place. Reskilling and upskilling, बस इतना है. Upskill and reskill करके most of the things that are being listed as problems because of AI in terms of unemployment can be resolved. Hence, that was also an issue that was discussed in BEST 2026. And of course, after that, sticky inflation and debt. So what is sticky inflation and what is the debt bomb here? Developing nations have, most nations in fact, they generally execute their welfare programs by taking debt. Debt in the sense that they take debt from multilateral organizations like the World Bank, or they take, or even other like Asian Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Most of these banks, global multilateral banks, they give debt, they give credit to the developing and least developed nations at very less interest rates, and the interest rates are like 0.5% a year, 1% a year, probably even less than that. So, but that also, because the amount of money that is taken in this debt is a lot. For example, because the amount of money is a lot, the interest payments become huge as well. For example, every year 18% of India's budget expenditure goes towards interest payments. Can you imagine? Our budget size is almost $600 billion annually. We spend this much annually. almost 1/5 of this, close to 100 to 110 billion dollars annually, is gone only on interest payments. That is quite a large number. So that's what my point is. Even the developing nations have huge debts. So this debt bomb, so to say, that is increasing because a lot of the least developed and developing nations are not able to pay back their interests because their economies are not doing it well. And why are their economies not doing well? Because of the global disruptions, be it in terms of the various conflicts that we've studied today, or be it in terms of the Trump policies and the tariff and trade wars that the Trump administration has started with multiple nations. You must remember that India is not the only country that Trump actually tariffed. He actually presented that big chart, if you remember, where he had listed the tariffs that he was putting on various countries. So yeah, these debt-ridden nations are spiraling. It can lead to economic crises also. So these issues were discussed, how to reduce the debt, and uske liye wahi hai, a way to reduce that debt is, of course, there is a way of restructuring the debt, and you restructure the debt by reducing the interest rate or foregoing some of the interest payments that these very poor, least developed countries have to give. So these are some ways that in which this debt can be restructured. Okay. And sticky inflation, of course, sticky inflation, because most of these countries have depreciating currencies against the dollar, and when their currencies are depreciating, since most of them are developing nations, they are import dependent, and because they are import dependent, it leads to imported inflation also. So that is why the inflation is sticky. Sticky inflation means inflation kam nahi ho raha hai. These were the main issues discussed. Moving on, if we look at now the developing nations and what their stance was regarding many of the things. So the West is actually focused a lot on resolving conflicts like Ukraine war and the Israel-Gaza conflict. So, and Trump is focusing on America first, hyper-nationalism, trying to tariff every single country that he knows, even if there is a very small trade deficit of USA with that country. So the developing nations and the least developed countries, they are being orphaned by the global community, in the sense that no one is helping them to reduce their debt or restructure their debt, and they are on their own terms of aid also. So going ahead, it is important that these countries of the global south, the developing nations of the least developed countries, their orphaning, so to say, is reduced and their debt is restructured through these global multilateral organizations only, like I was mentioning earlier, be it the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. Also, there are some issues regarding climate finance. Developing countries and developed countries का ये भी बहुत बड़ा issue है कि developing countries say that the developed countries are the primary culprits of climate change because they were the ones that increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere because they have been pursuing carbon intensive development paths since 18th 17th centuries, जब से वहाँ पे industrial revolution आया था west में. So they did their development by following carbon intensive mechanisms. They increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is still there because CO2 does not degrade very quickly. And now they also lecture the developing nations and the least developed countries कि तुम अपना development expenditure कम करो because you are causing a lot of carbon emissions, which is stupid. So they say that we will reduce the carbon emissions, but you pay us also climate finance के मामले में, that you give us money so that we are able to implement the green projects that will help reduce our carbon emission intensity. So climate finance is a very touchy topic between the West and the developing countries. उसके अलावा climate finance के साथ साथ they also say that there needs to be technology transfer in terms of more efficient power plants, more efficient nuclear power plants, more efficient renewable energy power plants from the West to the developing nations at subsidized costs, so that again they are able to reduce the carbon intensity of their economies. Green protectionism and non-tariff barriers, again as I was mentioning, that non-tariff barriers are basically non-tax barriers to trade. So green protectionism is, यहाँ पे जो example है वो है European Union का CBAM. CBAM is Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. What the European Union is trying to do, European Union is basically a collection of developed countries. What they are trying to do is they have very strict environment targets, that EU has a target of becoming net zero by 2050, for example. It's one of the strictest target. No other country that I know has actually mandated itself to a self-decided target of 2050. For example, China has a net zero target of 2060, India has a net zero target of 2070, US has no target. Anyway, so the European Union has established this mechanism called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, where they have said that any of the exports from any other country that come into the EU borders, and if that export product is actually causing carbon emissions in in the host country also. For example, let's say, just off the top of my head, if India exports cement to EU, and cement industries are very carbon polluting actually, so the EU will charge a tax, in the sense that they are basically saying that हम अपनी industry में जो polluting industries हैं, EU is saying we are closing down our polluting industries, so that means that we are foregoing the revenue that our countries will get from these polluting industries. Hence, we won't let you also take the revenue that you get from the carbon polluting industries. So if we are closing them down, you either close them down or you increase the green, or you green these industries. Basically, you reduce the carbon intensity of these countries, of these industries, even in your own country. So this is a tax, carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this countries like India, developing nations in general, they are saying that this is a form of a non-tariff barrier that the EU, that the developed countries like EU are putting in their trade against the least developed countries and the developing nations. So they are basically saying this is green protectionism in the name of climate activism. Okay, that is it. Now, if we look at the Indian stance at Davos 2026, so what exactly India did? It took, as I was mentioning, the largest ever delegation. Multiple union ministers, I think 2-3 union ministers went. The Commerce Minister, Shri Piyush Goyal, he generally goes every year. Other than that, I think I'm forgetting the other minister that went. Anyway, and 6 chief ministers went. So most of these chief ministers, I think. N. Chandrababu Naidu of Andhra definitely went. So most of these chief ministers, they established their own pavilions of the state. What do they do in their pavilions? They tell about the good policies, pro-industry policies, ease of doing business policies that these states are implementing, and they try and attract investments into their own states. For example, Andhra Pradesh, Sri N. Chandrababu Naidu, the chief minister, he's trying to establish an AI city in Visakhapatnam. So that is a very, I would say, a halo initiative, a very good initiative that can be used to attract foreign investment into that city. So yes, this is what these union ministers go to. They basically try and advertise the positives about the Indian economy. So there was a narrative shift that was seen, which is basically the positive that India actually was able to showcase in the World Economic Forum, and that is that it went with the idea of execution over just ambition. Till now, we have always said that we are going to be the largest major economy, fastest growing major economy. We are going to be a $5 trillion economy. We are going to do this. We are going to do this. That shows ambition. This time we went with the idea of execution. This is what we are doing. For example, India is already a leader in clean energy. India is already a leader in digital public infrastructure. I'm going to tell the examples of these things very quickly. So we are basically showing that we are already executing a lot of things that we have promised. That's why India has shown that democracies can deliver. That was also the message of the Prime Minister post-COVID, because we were able to give vaccines to 100 nations, even though we were democracy and we were giving vaccines to our own country even then. So yeah, execution over ambition and partnership over investment demands. So basically, this is what India is trying to pursue now. We have always demanded that the foreign countries should come and invest into our country and establish new industry. What we are now saying is that bring investment and partner with us. Don't just employ us, partner with us, because we have the capability to establish good joint ventures with you. We don't just need your money so that you can employ us. That's always a positive, of course, but yes, we are capable of partnering with you as well. So a narrative shift hua hai halka sa. And of course, IMF called India as the global growth engine because it has increased the GDP growth projection to about 7.5%, 7.4% for India, which is the largest, fastest growing major economy by a large margin, in fact. For example, China, I think, grew about 5% last year. Yes. Other than that, we are already leaders, as I was mentioning, in digital public infrastructure. What is digital public infrastructure? It is basically the digital infrastructure that is being owned by the government. For example, UPI. UPI is built upon the basic digital infrastructure that is owned by the government, and hence it is open source. Hence, there are so many companies that are utilizing it. Bheem is one of the tools that the government itself has implemented. Other than that, GPay is using, PhonePe is using that, BharatPay is using that, Paytm is using that. So this is the benefit of digital public infrastructure, that these companies, for example, these big tech companies, if let's say there was a big tech giant in India, it is not able to monopolize that technology. That's something that is happening in the USA. That's the benefit of digital public infrastructure. Every company can use that. Even for, and this ONDC also. ONDC is Open Network for Digital Commerce. I think this is even more genius than the UPI, but I think it's not as popular. Basically, what it is that these small nukkad जो kinara shops होती हैं, they can even list themselves on this ONDC platform for delivery, so that the delivery e-commerce is not monopolized by these big companies like Flipkart and Walmart and और क्या कहें Amazon and Snapdeal and etc. These big companies are they are like, it's like an oligopoly right now, because these major companies have about 80 to 90% market share, but ONDC is at least giving a chance to even these small shops that they can list on their own. And ONDC ka jo back infrastructure hai, that is being owned by the government, hence it's not owned by any private company, and because it's not owned by any private company, anyone can use it freely. So that's a positive. Yeah, this is the benefit of digital public infrastructure compared to USA, where the digital infrastructure is owned by the private companies, and of course they work on profit motives. Of course, and as I was mentioning, India is already leader in clean energy. We are already showing our energy transition leadership, because India is the only G20 nation. G20 is comprised of the 20 largest economies of the globe. India is the only G20 nation which is compliant with the Paris deal 2 degrees Celsius goal. Paris deal was a deal that was signed under the ambit of the United Nations in 2015, which has mandated that the world needs to limit the global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, or even better 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100, because if the world is not able to do that, then it can lead to irreversible damage in the atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, basically in the entire planet will go to hell. So that's why India is the only G20 nation which is compliant with the 2 degrees Celsius goal of the Paris deal. And we have, of course, under the Paris deal, there are some targets that the governments give on their own. They are called NDCs बोलते हैं, nationally determined contributions. So one of the NDCs was that India's total energy capacity will be 50% of that energy capacity will be renewable energy by 2030. But we've already achieved this target 5 years ahead of schedule. That is quite commendable, and no other nation has been able to do. They are able to achieve their own NDCs so ahead of schedule. So that's a very good positive. Okay, moving on. Of course, like we are the sole country that is being touted as a viable China plus destination, because no other country has the labor or the market depth that India can provide compared to China. Of course, the working population in India is almost equal to China. That's about 60 to 65% of the country's population is in the working age, and we have that market depth also, because we are a $4.2 trillion economy almost. We are not comparable to China yet, but yes, we have a very huge market, almost $1.5 to $2 trillion market, and of course, companies can China plus one. I hope सबको पता है China plus one. Please give me a thumbs up अगर सबको China plus one पता है. Cool. एक का आया. Major reason for not upscaling on ONDCR, I'm not really sure, because it's quite popular. मतलब it should be popular. It is quite good also. I don't know why people are not adopting it. तुम लोग करो ना, तुम लोग सब प्राइवेट सेक्टर वाले हो यार, अपने स्टार्टअप बढ़ाओ ONDC पे. It has such golden opportunities, I would say. Have some water. Thank you, man. PDF यार मैं डाल दूंगा, मैं ग्रुप पे डाल दूंगा. एक मिनट आ गया. Yes. Okay. So, China plus one ka, we are the sole country which can actually be a viable China plus one destination. China plus one is basically the various global companies diversifying their supply chains outside of China, because solely depending on China is not safe, as was seen during COVID. मैं पहले बता रहा था. And yes, bridging power and voice of global south. Bridging power in the sense that India is the only country, as I was mentioning, which can sit with the largest countries, most important countries on the globe, and as well as take the least developed nations with itself, because we have been able to provide a stance to the third world, to the global south, in the sense that हम उनके भी साथ हैं, or we are sitting with the top countries of the world as well. So we are acting as a bridging power. As if any one of you follows the comments of External Affairs Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar, he noted that India is a southwestern power. Southwestern power का मतलब क्या है? Where the south definitely takes precedence over the west. Southwestern power मतलब, in terms of many of our strategic interests, we are aligning with the West, in the sense that we want the same science and technology developments, we want the same R&D, we want good trade with them, we want labor mobility with them, we want our students to study there. We want their students to study in our countries, but we are also taking the interest of the global south with us. And because that, we are a southwestern power, so we are a bridging power. And of course, this way we are also a voice of the global south, where we are able to give a good representation to the interests of the global south. Of course, अब कुछ cons निकले हैं. Geeta Gopinath, she was one of the foremost economists of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, a few years ago, and she's also a Harvard economic professor. उन्होंने बहुत सही बात बोली कि इंडिया के लिए टैरिफ से बड़ा प्रॉब्लम है पोल्यूशन, because pollution reduces human capital formation, it reduces productivity of the workers, it acts as a negative deterrent on investment that can be coming from foreign nations. क्योंकि foreign nations वही देखते हैं, मतलब यार ये छोटी छोटी चीजें कि जैसे कभी भी फॉरेन कंट्री की किसी न्यूज़पेपर में इंडिया का आर्टिकल देख लो, या तो उन्होंने कोई कचरे का ढेर दिखा रखा होगा या फिर सिटी में पूरा धुआं दिखा रखा होगा. ये छोटी छोटी चीजें हमें लगता है क्या ही फर्क पड़ रहा है, बट we need to remember that any person sitting in these foreign nations, the only source they know about India is through these narratives that are built. So if these pollution problems, they are actually acting as a very big deterrent on Indian economy also. And this was mentioned by the economists. Along with that, jobless growth, yes, it has been an issue in India since 1990s. If you're aware of the metric called employment elasticity, employment elasticity basically means that defines the percentage increase in employment for 1% increase in GDP. Employment elasticity of India has been very less. It has been close to 0.1 to 0.2. For example, basically that means that for every 1% GDP growth, employment has increased by 0.1 to 0.2% only, which is very bad. Hence, we need to increase the job prospects of the country, and that will only come by, first of all, investing in sectors which are labor intensive. For example, textile, footwear, leather, as I was mentioning earlier, MSMEs, various MSMEs, and also by reskilling and upskilling, especially in fields like AI, which are going to determine the future of economies. Along with that, another problem that came up during the discussions in World Economic Forum about India is the manufacturing lag. Indian manufacturing sector has not been able to contribute more than 14 to 15% of the GDP since 1990s. It is fixed almost. वो ही अच्छी बात है कि घटा नहीं है ज्यादा, क्योंकि GDP has grown quite a lot, but it has maintained at 14 to 15% only, and services, they comprise almost 57 to 58% of our GDP. So this 14 to 15% actually shows a lag, because manufacturing is a sector, it is like a transitionary sector between agriculture and the tertiary sectors like services, which can absorb a lot of labor that is coming out of agriculture, because manufacturing tends to be more employment intensive compared to services. So that is a problem if manufacturing lag is there. Along with that, as I was mentioning, AI threat to BPO and IT service export model, because India is an outsourcing hub. A lot of things that are happening here in the back offices of various MNCs in India, they can be outsourced using AI. Hence, AI can be a threat. But as I mentioned earlier, remember, AI problem is only a structural unemployment problem. It can be improved if there is reskilling, upskilling. Of course, that's not easy, because we have a lot of people to reskill and upskill, but it can be resolved. And of course, you need to have a problem-solving mindset. Everyone highlights problems, but not a lot of people are there to solve those problems. Anyway, so way forward, if we look at it. So yes, this was also mentioned by various thinkers, commentators, including Geeta Gopinath herself during the Davos forum, that we need hard reforms of the factors of production, FOP. Factors of production generally are 3 or 4: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Land means if we have to, any industry that needs to set up needs land. And one of the biggest problems that have been there in ease of doing business in India is acquisition of land. Acquisition of land is difficult because सिंपल चीज, अगर मेरे को हाईवे बनाना है, उसमें मेरे को बहुत सारा अक्वायर करना पड़ता है फार्मलैंड में अक्वायर करना चाहूंगा. व्हाट इफ द फार्मर्स आर नॉट रेडी विद द नॉट ओके विद द कॉम्पेंसेशन प्राइस आई एम गिविंग टू देम? क्या करेंगे फिर? दैट्स वन ऑफ द रीजंस व्हाई projects in India, especially large industries in India, face so much delays and cost overruns also. Factors of production में second क्या आता है? लैंड के बाद लेबर जो अभी फॉर एग्जांपल इफ यू फॉलोइंग द न्यूज़ अ बिट, 4 labor codes had come in 2019 and 2020: wages, social security, occupational safety and health, and social industrial relations. These 4 labor codes have recently been implemented. So they had come in 19 and 20, but they were implemented recently, and the rules have come in these 4 labor codes now. So this is a very, very good reform. मतलब I don't know if you realize the scale of this reform, because more than 29 labor laws, which were different laws, they were collated into 4 laws. So going ahead, the practical solution obviously would be to get it to one law in the some later stage. But yes, it's a very good reform. So that is a very core factor reform that was done. Labor reform, land, labor, capital. Third is capital. Capital basically means easy credit. Easy credit, especially to the smaller companies like the MSMEs that I was talking about, because we often see that जो ये बड़े बड़े कंपनीज एंड फ्रॉड्स होते हैं, फॉर एग्जांपल 11,000 करोड़ 12,000 करोड़ विजय माल्या, नीरव मोदी एटसेट्रा एटसेट्रा, ये सुनने में आते हैं तो हमें ऐसा लगता है कि सारे कॉर्पोरेट्स ऐसे ही होते हैं, मतलब चोर डकैती ही कर रहे हैं. बट वी नीड टू रियलाइज जो ये एमएसएमईज होते हैं उनके क्रेडिट इतने नहीं होते. उनके क्रेडिट कितना होगा? 50 लाख का लोन ले लिया, 30 लाख का लोन ले लिया, 40 लाख का लोन ले लिया, and the interest rates that they have to pay are sometimes very high also. So they are not the problem. These big frauds are the problem. But problem फिर जो बैंक्स होते हैं वो उनके पीछे भी, उनके गले के पीछे भी भागते हैं जो ये छोटे छोटे लोन्स लेते हैं, बिकॉज ऑफ कोर्स उनको कहीं ना कहीं से तो अपना पैसा वापस चाहिए बैंक्स को. सो अब वो ये कि 11,000 करोड़ वाला आदमी तो कुछ ना कुछ करके निकल लेगा, वो पॉलिटिशियंस को पैसे दे देगा, वो कुछ ना कुछ करके भाग देश से बाहर भाग जाएगा. गले किसके पड़ते हैं? एमएसएमईज के. सो दैट इज एन इशू बिकॉज MSMEs, as I was mentioning, there are 6.5 crore MSMEs that have been registered in the country, and they are giving employment to crores of people. So they are important and they need access to easy credit. So land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship basically means the entrepreneurial drive that is there in a country, and the policies that can be implemented to increase that entrepreneurial drive. The Startup India mission of the government of India is one very such good initiative. So the Startup India initiative has increased. Has got quite a lot of increase in the registrations of startups. For example, in 2018, खाली पेज नहीं छोड़ रहा मैंने, 2018 there were about 15k startups that were registered with the government of India under the Startup India mission. In 2024 they were 1.5 lakh. That's a 10x jump in 6 years. I know it's not enough, but it's crazy good, and we need to further improve that metric also, because and it's definitely improving every year. So I would say that these are some of the initiatives that are factor reforms, but of course they need to be further reformed. There is a lot of scope for reform, and that's what the main point of Geeta Gopinath was, that land and labor reforms especially will be our primary movers from the 4 trillion mark to the 10 trillion mark, if we need to get to a 10 trillion economy by 2033-34, somewhere around that time. So yeah, these will be the most important things. Of course, AI first reskilling is required, as I was mentioning. And yes, this is a term that is often there, demographic dividend. So what does demographic dividend mean? Demographic dividend basically means that we have a very huge surplus of population in the working age group, that is 15 to 64. 15 to 64 is considered the working age population group. So about 60 to 65% of our population is in this group. That means out of the 140 crore people, it will be about 80 to 85 crore people are there in the working age population. Imagine the amount of productive capital and the productive efficiency that they can bring if they are properly, if their health is good, if they're skilled, if their education levels are good. It can lead to a huge boost in the economy. That is what the demographic dividend is about, that we need to realize our demographic dividend, but that can be only realized through skilling and upskilling and reskilling. And of course, in the AI era, the AI centric upskilling and reskilling becomes essential. And if we don't use these this huge amount of the working age population productively, it can change the demographic dividend to a demographic disaster. Because अब वैसे सोचो कि जो यूथ होती है, they are very good at earning money if they are productively utilized. But अगर वो खाली बैठे हैं, वो क्या करेंगे? अपने आप को बिजी रखने के लिए कुछ ना कुछ करेंगे, फिर सोशल क्राइम्स बढ़ते हैं, जो सोसाइटल कॉन्फ्लैग्रेशंस होते हैं रिगार्डिंग कम्युनिटी, कास्ट, ये सब बढ़ते हैं, क्राइम्स अगेंस्ट विमेन बढ़ते हैं. तो इसीलिए वी नीड टू इंश्योर दैट दिस यूथ पॉपुलेशन इज प्रोडक्टिवली यूटिलाइज्ड. उसके लिए रीस्किलिंग अपस्किलिंग इज एब्सोल्युटली एसेंशियल. एंड ऑफ कोर्स द वर्ल्ड इकोनॉमिक फोरम ऑल्सो, मतलब उससे भी एक ये रिकमेंडेशन, मतलब अब वो ये कि ये वर्ल्ड इकोनॉमिक फोरम ने ही रिकमेंडेशंस नहीं दी हैं, बहुत सारे टॉक्स हुए थे, उसके दौरान some commentators said these things, some commentators said these things. It's like that. So basically, another recommendation for India is that it can lead the green south. So basically, the term is global south, but it is it's like a change of the terminology to express that India can show green leadership, in the sense that, as I was mentioning, it is one of the few countries, only G20 nation that is in sync with the 2 degrees Celsius Paris deal goal. Along with that, India has also launched quite a lot of global initiatives in for reaping the benefits of the green economy. The primary of one of them being the GBA. GBA is the Global Biofuel Alliance. India launched this in 2023 during its G20 presidency. Global Biofuel Alliance, basically it's a network of countries that come together to share information and also research on the importance of biofuels and integrating them into the economy better. And of course, as we know, biofuels are less carbon intensive than fossil fuels. The ISA is the International Solar Alliance. And of course, it works on research, implementation of solar energy technology. And the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure is basically aimed at improving the disaster resilience of existing infrastructure so that the issues that are being faced by developing nations due to climate change fueled disasters reduces. So again, these are all India-led bodies and they are all headquartered in New Delhi. So that's a good thing. Yeah. So yeah, Green South को हम इस तरीके से lead कर सकते हैं. This was all about the World Economic Forum. Now we coming to the economic survey. थोड़ा लंबा topic है. I try to finish it in hopefully jaldi. So economic survey came on 29th Jan 2026 and union budget आज आया है 1st Feb को. Okay, so economic survey basically what exactly does economic survey do? Economic survey एक चीज करता है कि it gives a macro overview of the economy of the past year. तो 25-26 इसलिए economic survey जो है वो एक साल मतलब 25-26 का है, the year that has already passed, and the union budget is of 26-27. That is the year that is incoming. So that's the difference. Yeah. So the main idea that was promoted by the economic survey this year, the central thesis was that India is transitioning from strategic resilience, that is surviving shocks, because there have been quite a lot of global shocks over the past few years. As we have already discussed, there were quite a lot of conflicts. There was the COVID pandemic also. And through all these shocks, India has been one of the most resilient economies because during the COVID year, 2020, it had negative GDP growth rate. But after that, it has been positive and it has been a good amount of positive GDP growth. Yeah, so we have been able to survive a lot of the shocks. And now we are moving to strategic indispensability in the sense that we are becoming essential to other nations' economies also by integrating ourselves into the global value chains of various products that are produced across the globe. So, yeah, if we look at the executive snapshot, we'll just go quickly through the main metrics that are there. So, as I was mentioning, it gives a snapshot of the economy of the past year. So, the real GDP growth has been estimated, of course, estimated because the financial year has still not ended. Financial year will end in March. So, April say FY27 will start. So, right now, the estimated real GDP growth rate is 7.4%, and it's of course the highest amongst major economies. And I would like to ask you this. Do you know the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP growth? I'm hoping everyone knows that. The only difference is inflation. Okay. Yes. So inflation has been very good over the past year. It has been below 2%. So the RBI has a metric that it needs to maintain the inflation at 2 to 6%. That is 4 plus minus 2%. So yeah, 2 to 6% के बीच में कहीं पे भी inflation होता है तो it's a good thing because some amount of inflation is absolutely necessary and I'm hoping everyone knows why, because अगर inflation negative हो जाता है, let's say the prices of products start decreasing every year, let's say आज एक कार 1 लाख की है, नेक्स्ट ईयर 80,000 की होगी सेम कार, तो कंज्यूमर्स के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से शॉर्ट टर्म में तो बहुत अच्छा लगता है कि हाँ भाई सस्ते में मिल रही है गाड़ी, बट थिंक अबाउट इट फ्रॉम द पर्सपेक्टिव ऑफ द प्रोड्यूसर्स. The producers are actually making a loss on the car, so they will stop producing that car. If they stop producing that car, तो जो सप्लाई है वो ही कम हो जाएगा, तो सामान ही बनाना बंद कर देंगे लोग, उनका प्रॉफिट नहीं होगा. तो सो इसलिए some amount of inflation is necessary for a healthy economy. Hence 2 to 6% is the ideal RBI का window in which it needs to maintain the inflation. उसके अलावा इन्फ्लेशन लास्ट ईयर में एवरेज लेस देन 2% रहा है, मतलब अप्रैल टू दिसंबर 2025 इट हैज बीन लेस देन 2%. सो इट इज not perfect because it's not 2 to 6%, but it's not that problematic because it is थोड़ा सा increase ही कर रहा है. So it's fine. Fiscal deficit if सबको I'm hoping पता ही है, it means total expenditure minus total revenue of the government. Fiscal deficit stands at 4.8%, and of course, as I was mentioning, almost all governments, and fiscal deficit also comes equal to the debt that the government has to borrow, मतलब the amount of money that the government has to borrow, because of course fiscal deficit means the expenditure that will be done over and above the revenue. तो अगर रेवेन्यू से ज्यादा एक्सपेंडिचर हो रहा है तो वो बोरो करके ही होता है, ऑफ कोर्स. तो फिस्कल डेफिसिट 4.8% ऑफ द जीडीपी है, and it had been budgeted at 4.9%. So it's good that we are beating the budget target, and it will be reduced to 4.4% at the end of FY 2026. That we are talking about March 2027. At that point of time, fiscal deficit of the Indian GDP of the Indian budget will be of the Indian government will be 4.4%. That's a target. Along with that, we have seen a sovereign rating improvement, जो कि ज्यादा नहीं करते हैं. S&P अब आई एम अज्यूमिंग ये sovereign rating जो होती है AAA, BBB, ये B और CCC वगैरह, ये सबको आइडिया है. बेसिकली इट मींस दैट जितना better letter है उतना better sovereign rating है, and this is a rating of the bonds that are issued by that government. So for example, if the Indian government bonds are rated at BBB, they are investment grade. Investment grade means that they are worthy of investments. Hence, an investor sitting in some other country, if he wants to invest in the Indian government bonds, he'll look at these ratings and see that if they are investment grade, he can safely invest. And if they are not investment grade, then they are generally very shy of investing in unsecured bonds. But of course, that is also true that if the bonds issued by a government are insecure, generally the interest rates provided on that bonds are more. I'm hoping everyone is comfortable with the concept of bond. Like समझ आता है सबको क्या होता है bond? Okay, cool. आता है, काफी सारे yes आ गए. Basically it means a debt. Okay, कुछ का no भी आया. अच्छा ठीक है, बता दो जल्दी से. एक होता है क्रेडिटर, एक होता है बोरोवर. क्रेडिटर ही बोलते हैं ना बैंक को, हाँ. सो इफ बी इज बोरोइंग मनी फ्रॉम ए, देन ये बेसिकली लोन होता है ना, कि लोन दे रहे हैं बी को. देन ये जो लोन है इसका अगर मैं वैसे मानूं, इट्स लाइक बॉन्ड इज एन अग्रीमेंट ऑफ अ लोन. सो बॉन्ड, अगर if I'm the bank A, if I'm the creditor A, I need to raise some money, if I need to invest some money, then B will be issuing a bond कि मेरे को पैसा चाहिए, मेरे को पैसा दो. तो जो क्रेडिटर है वो B को पैसा देगा, और वो जो अग्रीमेंट है वो बॉन्ड कहलाता है. आई थिंक समझा नहीं पाया मैं ढंग से, एक मिनट रुको. बॉन्ड बैंक नहीं कंसिडर करते. लेट्स कंसिडर टू पीपल. यस, two people. B needs money and A has money. B needs money, he'll issue a bond. Bond is basically a paper agreement, and इसमें लिखा होगा कि मेरे को 100 रुपीज चाहिए एंड मैं तुम्हें एनुअली 8% इंटरेस्ट के साथ वापस कर दूंगा वो. ठीक है, तो ये बेसिकली बॉन्ड पे लिखा है. तो ए क्या बोलेगा, आई हैव 100 रुपीज, आई वॉन्ट द 8% रिटर्न, आई विल बाय दैट बॉन्ड. तो ए विल बाय दैट बॉन्ड एंड बी विल गेट द मनी. Cool. This is what a bond is basically. It's like a debt agreement, loan agreement of sorts. बस उतना समझ लो. तो every government issues bonds because basically every government is like B. They need money, a lot of money in fact. So they issue bonds in the open market. So even retail investors like us, अपन भी government bonds में invest कर सकते हैं. Government के bond में, अगर किसी को Indian government के bond में invest करना है तो RBI का एक वो है, portal है. It's called the retail एक scheme है, retail direct scheme. You can actually directly invest in government of India bonds if you are. And of course, like government bonds are considered very safe. तो वो 7% interest देते हैं return, and they are completely safe. So still better than fixed deposits. जो हमारे मम्मी डैडी बोलते हैं। एनीवे, तो यस, तो दैट्स व्हाट अ बॉन्ड इज। तो जो सॉवरेन रेटिंग है वो गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया के बॉन्ड्स की रेटिंग होती है, जो ये बहुत सारी रेटिंग एजेंसी सुनी होंगी, स्टैंडर्ड एंड पुअर है, ये S&P जो लिखा है, उसके अलावा मैं भूल गया और कौन सी होती थी, मेरे को याद नहीं आ रही थी। एनीवे, तो S&P इज वन जिसने BBB जो है सॉवरेन रेटिंग ऑफ इंडियन गवर्नमेंट बॉन्ड्स को इंप्रूव किया, तो इट विल अट्रैक्ट मोर इन्वेस्टमेंट, विच इज अ पॉजिटिव साइन। Service export hit a record high of almost $390 billion and we have a merchandise। हाँ, आपको ये थोड़ा सा डिटेल बता रहा हूँ। इंडिया का जो ट्रेड है उसमें वी हैव गुड्स और एक्सपोर्ट्स, दो ट्रेड होते हैं, गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज के दो ट्रेड होते हैं। गुड्स में वी हैव अ डेफिसिट एंड सर्विसेज में वी हैव अ सरप्लस। एंड जनरली जो ऑफ कोर्स जो ये सरप्लस है ये डेफिसिट को कवर करने में हेल्प करता है। ओके, आई थिंक दिस इज लाइक अ गुड स्नैपशॉट ऑफ द इंडियन इकोनॉमी ऊपर से। अब थोड़ा सा डिटेल में आते हैं। पोटेंशियल ग्रोथ रेट